And good morning, church. Isn't that lovely? I have to say, though, right there at the end, as Greg was singing, I had a sudden thought of what was I thinking, putting a lullaby right before I preach? Well, we'll have to get through that somehow, shan't we, right? Well, this Advent and Christmas, our theme is the characters of Christmas. And each Sunday, we're looking at a different character in the Christmas story to see how we can identify with that character and come away with a deeper, more personal understanding of the significance of Christmas, a greater appreciation of what God has done. So the first week, we examined the ancient prophets, this group of prophets from the Old Testament who function as a composite character in the story, provide evidence for God's activity in bringing His Son into the world in the form of this collection of predictions about the Messiah. And last week we looked at Mary, the poor peasant girl who was willing to pay the price of personal dishonor in her family and in her community in order to be God's servant, the vehicle that He needed in order to bring a miracle into the world, the birth of His Son. Well, this week, as you've noticed, our focus is Joseph. He's the character who's usually in the background in the story. We tend to ignore him, except to make sure that he's across from Mary on the opposite side of the manger, so we have a nicely balanced scene for our nativity set. But Joseph is much more than just a stand-in for a picture. His role as the faithful caretaker is an essential part of the drama that brought God's Son into the world. Well, like Mary, Joseph lived in Nazareth. His home was in the same out-of-the-way, small and unimportant village on the hillside in Galilee. His family was poor. From Matthew chapter 13, verses 54 and 55, we learned that he was a workman in the construction trade. Because when Jesus comes home to visit, the folks there say, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? Aren't his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us?" Like many, if not most translations, the NIV refers to Joseph as a carpenter. And that translation, like the words from the hymn we sang earlier, reflects the experience of Christians in Northern Europe, where the lands were filled with forests and wood was often the primary building material. And it's perfectly understandable that they and we might think of him with those kinds of images in our minds. But Galilee in the first century was different. There were fewer trees, and homes were usually made of stone or dried mud. And the Greek word that Matthew uses to describe Jesus' earthly father, and which is used elsewhere in the Gospels to describe Jesus himself, is teknon. It means a builder, someone who works in construction or builds things from wood or brick or stone. It's a workman. And Nazareth in the first century was far too small and its residents far too poor for a builder to earn a living by making things for the other villagers. Joseph might have been able to do some work now and then in the village itself, but like hundreds or even thousands of others in the region, he would have hiked each day to Sepphoris, which Josephus, first century Jewish historian, called the ornament of all Galilee, claimed it was the largest city in Galilee. And this rapidly growing Roman city was about an hour's walk from Nazareth. There were large public building projects that kept the local population of men employed as day laborers. So Matthew introduces Joseph by noting that he was pledged to Mary, the mother of Jesus the Messiah, Mary. Now don't make the mistake of thinking that this was like engagement in our culture. The pledge that's referred to in this verse was known as betrothal. And according to Jewish law, betrothal was a very specific period between the time a man signed a contract for marriage with the father of his bride-to-be and then the formal ceremony of marriage, after which the man would take his wife for the first time into his home, and then they would consummate the marriage. The period of betrothal normally lasted about a year. During that time, the man would prepare his dwelling place to receive his bride. But once the marriage contract was signed and the bride price was paid, the two were legally considered married, even though the woman remained in the home of her father and the two were not permitted to be alone together. If either one died while betrothed, The other one was regarded as a widow or a widower. Fornication by either party during the betrothal period was regarded as adultery and legally punishable. And a formal divorce was necessary to end the marriage so long as both were alive, even though the wedding ceremony hadn't yet taken place and the couple presumably had not yet been intimate with one another. Matthew's description clearly places the time of the events during this betrothal period. It is before they had come together. That is, before the wedding had taken place and before Joseph had taken Mary into his home. Matthew is taking great care to demonstrate that Mary was a virgin at the time the two were betrothed. And furthermore, the community's expectation would have been for both of them to remain chaste throughout their betrothal period. Unlike our culture today, modesty in dress and restrictions on sexual activity were characteristic of Jewish society in the first century. As a general rule, purity was highly prized, and families were very protective of their daughters and women in general. And this is not to say that sexual immorality was absent. The Bible gives ample testimony to the contrary. But customs regarding purity and marriage were very deeply entrenched in the culture. And there was a great deal of societal pressure, especially for the women, to maintain virginity prior to marriage. So the discovery that Mary was pregnant would therefore have come as a great shock to Joseph. Mary's departure to be with her relative Elizabeth had been sudden, and everyone in the village would have known about it. She'd been gone from her village for about 3 months, and her return, now pregnant, put Joseph in a very awkward position. We don't know if Mary informed Joseph that she was pregnant and tried to explain things to him, but he didn't believe her, or if she said nothing and he had discovered her condition through some other avenue and then believed the worst. In whatever case, however he found out about it, his conclusion was simple. Mary had either been unfaithful or she had been raped. And either way, he faced a difficult decision. Now, given Joseph's natural and very understandable assumptions, he had only 3 options he could take. He could publicly accuse Mary of adultery and called for her to be stoned in accordance with Mosaic law. However, stoning for adultery, even though it was prescribed in the law, was not very common in the first century. More often, the second option was taken. He could divorce her publicly. That would bring shame on Mary and on her family in front of the community. It could also even lead to him being shamed in the eyes of the community. There might be some who would assume that his actions were being taken as a dodge in order to cover up his own guilt in the matter. Furthermore, a public divorce in a small village could easily introduce deep conflicts between families who already had a long history and an unknown future in the same community. The divorce might cause as many or more problems than it solved. That left the third option. Joseph could legally divorce Mary, but privately before a couple of witnesses, and simply walk away from the marriage. Private divorce would bring the least amount of humiliation for her and for him as well. Rumors would probably continue, but eventually they might fade away. And in any case, he would be free to look for another wife with limited social repercussions in the village. Well, Matthew's introductory paragraph offers us 3 character traits for Joseph. First of all, he's a faithful Jew. He's a man who's devout, deeply concerned to obey the Mosaic law. He cares about doing what's right, doing what God wants. He's very sincere about being righteous. Consequently, he's deeply distraught over what he perceives as Mary's faithlessness. Joseph knows he was not the one who was unfaithful. But he also knows that there will be those who simply assume that he's responsible for her pregnancy. And that in itself is devastating to his personal sense of honor. And even if he told himself that perhaps she was forced by someone, his own desire to be righteous before God, combined with his deeply rooted sense of honor, meant that he could not simply ignore the fact of her pregnancy. It was a threat to his own honor, to his family's honor, and ultimately to God's honor. Many people today in our culture think very little about honor and have very little concern about being righteous, particularly when it comes to matters of sexuality. The notion of doing what is right, of maintaining a standard of morality that conforms to God's ways, is routinely declared by a myriad of voices to be obsolete, out of touch. It's naive. In fact, it's even hurtful and hateful. To them, Joseph's dilemma seems artificial and incomprehensible. But not for Joseph. He was intent on following God's ways, even though it would cost him, even though it hurt him deeply to do so. And it was his determination to do what God required of him that ultimately empowered his decisions and his actions that were, quite simply, heroic. Second, Matthew's description alerts us to the fact that Joseph is highly sensitive to the need for honor. He accepts the cultural norm that one must always seek to gain honor and to avoid shame. He puts his need to maintain personal and familial honor above his own desire to be married, even above his desire to be married to this particular young girl. Presumably, he had asked his father to secure the marriage for him. At the least, he had agreed that it was a good choice to marry Mary, and he was looking forward to their marriage with great anticipation. But honor mattered more than his own desires. And for that matter, he was also keenly aware of the cost of disgrace for Mary. And that's why he sought to minimize her humiliation as much as possible. He would not drag her name or her reputation through the mud, even though he couldn't protect her completely against whatever whispers or nods might lie in her future. Once again, you and I don't live in a culture that is as highly focused on honor and shame as Joseph's culture was. From our perspective, it is easy for us to identify what we see as problems that come from being driven by the avoidance of shame. We're not so quick to identify the problems that come from being dismissive of shame, of not caring at all what others think about our actions or how our actions might affect the people around us. Our intense individualism has some well-documented advantages to it, but it also comes with an immense capacity for doing damage, which is also well-documented, even if it's frequently ignored. Joseph's character is a reminder to us that the desire to live honorably is neither foolish nor pointless nor obsolete. It was precisely his strong commitment to living honorably that motivated him to become the faithful caretaker that God needed to care for his son. And the third feature we see in Joseph's character in this introductory passage is painted in the most muted of colors, and that is that he is merciful. He cares about Mary. He cares about her family. He cares about what will happen to her. And despite his very strong internal tendency to be mostly concerned about what is right, he's not inflexibly set on seeing that the precise punishment is carried out in accordance with the demands of the law. And Joseph is torn because he knows he cannot ignore this violation of his trust, but he cannot bring himself to demand that Mary be punished. Mercy triumphed over judgment in the heart of Joseph. And he sought for a way to let kindness soften the blow that she would have to bear. Matthew thus presents us with a brief but quite effective description of a good man faced with a difficult conundrum. He's devout, he's faithful to the law, he's intent on doing what is right, resolute in seeking honor, but tempered with a healthy portion of mercy and kindness, and he's forced to choose between bitter options, all of which will bring him both pain and some measure of disgrace. But it's what happened next. What happened next in the story and Joseph's response that sets him apart as an unusually profound example of a man whom God used to bring about his plan for the world. Back to Joseph in his conundrum. He's come to the conclusion about what he must do. He's going to divorce her privately. But before he can act upon his decision, God speaks to him through an angelic visitation in his dream. And the angel begins his message by addressing Joseph as son of David. It's a striking phrase. It's a reference to the royal lineage, to Israel's most famous king, and the angel is using it to address a stonemason, a day laborer. God was calling Joseph to recognize his identity as a descendant of David, to recognize his own importance that was not based on what he'd accomplished nor on his social status, but upon his connection to the purposes and the promises of God. Joseph stood in a unique place, a place that was his simply by virtue of the call of God rather than anything of his own doing. But it was one that would require him to consent to what God wished to do through him, as Mary had to do. Because, what God was going to do was not going to be done in spite of him or apart from him, but through him. God was calling Joseph as he had called his ancestor King David, and announcing to Joseph that he was fulfilling this promise made to David. He would have a son who would save his people. But being in the lineage of David did not mean that Joseph was going to become a king. Joseph wasn't going to become anyone famous, not in his own time at least. The angel's message said nothing about what Joseph would become, except that he will become the husband of the woman who is currently pregnant with the Son of God. And what Joseph doesn't yet know, but would soon discover, was that God was calling Joseph into a role that would require him to maintain his faith in what God told him, the most fantastic and unbelievable of promises imaginable. To maintain his faith in what God told him while he lives out his life in obscurity and poverty and the drudgery of everyday ordinariness. Joseph would have to hold on to the promise of God despite the complete lack of affirmation from the world around him. Nobody's helping him hold on to that. And he would have to do it while being tasked with the most crucial responsibility ever given to a human being, raising the Son of God as if he were his own. Well, the most striking thing to note about Joseph in the portion of Matthew we read today is this. When Joseph wakes up from his sleep, he immediately obeys what God has told him to do. 4 times God speaks to him in a dream, and 4 times he instantly obeys. It is the mark of a man who's devoted to God, who will honor what God has said no matter how costly it is to his own desires or to his plans. A man who lives to serve God and to honor him in every bit of his life. So after he wakes up, Joseph immediately takes action to marry his betrothed Mary. He takes her into his home as his wife, but he does not consummate the marriage, so that they are, in a sense, still only betrothed before God, which Luke makes reference to, by the way, though they are married in the eyes of the community. Taking this step of bringing her into his home requires that Joseph willingly accept the dishonor and shame that is attached to Mary for being pregnant prior to being married. He knows he's not the father. He also knows that most of the people in the village, if not all of them, will assume that he is. They will assume that the two of them broke their promise of remaining chaste until the wedding, and that the quick action of this earlier than expected wedding meant that Joseph was acknowledging that he was the father of Mary's child. But even though Joseph knows he is not the father of the child in Mary's womb, he has agreed to welcome this baby as his own. And he has assumed the responsibility to raise this boy as his own son, ignoring the shame, completely disregarding the community's judgments, despite his natural inclination to defer to those judgments. Whatever dishonor they might dish out, he will live honorably before God and raise this child in the fear of God, not the fear of what others might say. It's also especially significant to notice what Matthew says about Joseph's determination to defer having intercourse until after Mary gives birth. Now, Matthew primarily includes this note because he wants his readers to understand the importance of Joseph's action so that they and we recognize the miracle of the virgin birth as well as its fulfillment of prophecy. But we may also discern something more of the character of Joseph in his loving and honorable choice to abstain from sexual relations with his wife until the child is born. And once again, it concerns honor. Once Joseph understood that Mary had not been unfaithful, that she was carrying a child by a miraculous intervention of the Holy Spirit, Joseph was committed to honoring God by preserving and protecting both Mary and the child in every way possible. His commitment to refrain from what was his by right, normal marital relations with his wife, well, that showed that he recognized the uniqueness of the situation, the holiness of what God was doing, and the importance of his own role in this. Joseph would protect the child. He would protect Mary. He would protect her honor, and he would do so no matter what it would cost him. Joseph understood that God had called him to be a caretaker, responsible for the life and the well-being of the child in the womb of his betrothed. And all of his actions of obedience to God's words and to God's warnings, all of those involved protecting the child and facilitating the fulfillment of God's plan, even when that plan meant fleeing to a foreign land for a time or returning to a home where stories were still being told about his unusual marriage. Joseph's role was not easy, but it was clear. He would be the earthly father for this Son of God. No one else would know what he knew. Herod's attempt on the life of Jesus made it very obvious that Joseph and Mary would have to keep his identity a secret. Meanwhile, Joseph would embrace this son as his own. And his role would be to raise this child. He would have to teach him how to be a man, to model for him what that looked like. Joseph would have to teach him how to do chores, how to use tools, how to read. He would show him how to care for his mother, how to lead his brothers and sisters, how to function in the family. He would teach him a trade, to learn how to do what he himself did, to be a builder, a construction worker. He would teach his son how to work, how to make things so that they would last, how to repair things when they broke, how to know which materials were best for whatever it was you were building. He would teach him how to handle himself on the job, how to deal with the overseers, how to deal with customers, how to deal with the neighbors, how to deal with the Romans. Unlike Mary, Joseph had no part to play in the miracle of the birth of Jesus. That is, he was not needed to bring about the miracle. The conception of Jesus in Mary's womb was entirely the work of the Holy Spirit with the consent of Mary. But Joseph was very much needed in order to allow that miracle to come to its full fruition. The caretaker was needed to see that the Son of God would be born in Bethlehem, and then that Son of God who was born in Bethlehem could grow up to become a man familiar with the life in Galilee, someone who could walk among his people as one of them. Likewise, as Matthew clearly points out in the narrative, it was God's intervention that protected the young family from the designs of Herod and from the threat of Archelaus. But apart from the divine warnings, Joseph was powerless to keep the three of them from falling into the hands of the king. However, it was through Joseph's obedience to the directives of the angelic messenger, well, that's what brought God's deliverance of his son into concrete reality. Nothing about what Joseph did with Jesus was glamorous or unusual. His task as a parent for Jesus during his growing up years was extraordinarily mundane. Yeah, there was that time they had to adapt to life in a huge foreign city, but they lived among other Jews, so life continued on somewhat the same. There was that one trip to Jerusalem that was proving so astonishing. But other than that, Joseph's part in raising Jesus as his son was quite ordinary. He simply did what he knew how to do, living his ordinary life by following whatever it was that God told him to do and making room for God to do what he does through us. Now, there's a final chapter to this story. The passage I noted earlier from Matthew 13, which is paralleled in both Mark and Luke, is notable for what is not there. And what is not there is Joseph himself. Mary's mentioned by name. Jesus' brothers are mentioned by name. His sisters are mentioned without being named. That's a fairly common practice at the time. The whole family is referenced, but only Jesus' mother and siblings are spoken of as if they are both known to the community and also presently alive. This is not the only place in the Gospels where this happens. There's a couple of other incidents that indicate Joseph is not present with the rest of the family. And the question is, well, why? It's possible, I suppose, that Joseph was simply doing his normal job, hiking to Sepphoris and finding work where he could, and he wasn't around during the day. But that just seems unlikely, since the rest of the family, including Jesus' brothers, who are old enough to work, are present with him. What's most likely is that Joseph has died sometime after Jesus was 12, when he's mentioned in the incident in Jerusalem, and then before Jesus begins his ministry, some 18 years later. That means that Joseph faithfully raised his son for somewhere between 12 and 30 years and never saw the full fruit of all of his labor. He never got to see the Son of God begin his ministry and do what he came to do. Joseph died as he had lived, in obscurity, in poverty, but faithfully carrying out his responsibility as the caretaker of the Son of God and leaving us an example of how we ought to live. As those who are called to live before God by faith, to honor God, no matter what the world around us says about us. As we obey God in our everyday, ordinary lives, God does remarkable work in and through us, even bringing miracles into the spaces that we inhabit for the people that are right around us. His life is a reminder that you too might be able to have an impact that's eternal on the people right around you in your everyday life. You're not going to raise the Son of God. You might just raise your own kids or grandkids or help the neighbors or somebody else in church with theirs. It just needs your obedience.